Hey there, and welcome to this episode of Speaking of. This is a segment where I will dig into a contemporary issue, and I'll try to wrestle with it from a Christian point of view. Often, you'll find that I don't necessarily take positions too much one way or the other, but what I want to do is sort of provide a Christian framework or a Christian lens through which we can evaluate contemporary issues. And I want to challenge you to reach your own conclusions, but to wrestle with these topics from a Christian point of view. And today I thought we'd tackle the issue of gun control, which if you're not in an American context, you may not realize that this is really a major, it's a pretty sensitive topic, or at least it's a potentially conflicted topic. People have very strong opinions on this, and so it's with some sense of fear and trepidation that I wade right into the middle of this. But it's an issue that and I should say right up front, I'm not a gun owner, but I'm not necessarily opposed to firearms, but I thought it would be sort of fun is maybe not the right word, but I thought it would be a good thing to just sort through this and see what sense we can make of this issue from a Christian point of view. And the reason why now, well, this issue was on the ballot just last week. When we had our election here, there was a proposition here in Oregon, Prop 114, and it was passed very narrowly. It looks like 51 to 49%. It was passed, and this measure imposes some restrictions on the number of magazines that the number of magazines in a gun. I so you can obviously tell I'm not a gun expert. Here's what the Oregon Statesman Journal said about it. It said it's a strict gun measure that requires individuals to obtain a permit before purchasing a gun. It bans large capacity magazines that hold more than 10 rounds of ammunition and creates a statewide firearms database. And so it was attempting, the measure is attempting, and if implemented it will put limits on the sorts of firearms that a person can buy and own, and it will attempt to put some safeguards in place in terms of who can purchase guns, and try to create some restrictions and some limits. Now, the interesting thing is, in the wake of this passing, at least a number of sheriffs throughout the state have indicated that they're not going to enforce either the entire measure or at least parts of the measure that have been passed. So I saw one, Lynn County, which is just a little way south of us here, where I'm at in Salem, they've already said that they're not going to enforce this bill because they believe it to be unconstitutional, and so they're not going to enforce it. Now, so that's on the one hand. You get a large group of people, and again, some of this is, if you're not in an American context, it maybe helps to know some of the background here. There are a large number of people who believe very strongly in our Second Amendment, which says that the government cannot take away your right to own firearms. And so historically in America, that has always, any form of what we call gun control is always met with a lot of resistance. And that's what's happening here. Now, on the other hand, of course, we have to face the reality that there were, just this week again, there were at least another couple of school shootings. I think University of Virginia was where one happened, and there were 3 or 4 people killed. Now, that was a targeted attack, and so that's a little different than some of the random ones that we've seen. But we have to come to grips with that as well. As a culture and as a nation, we have a very high rate of firearm deaths that are gun violence, homicide in our country, and that's we have to ask the question why. And so there's this tension that exists in our culture, and I know people even here at Sunny Slope will have there'll be people on both sides that have fairly strong opinions on this. Now, I cannot speak myself to how well the law was written, and I'm not even really an expert in the constitutionality of this particular law that passed here in Oregon. In other words, one of the criticisms of this law that was just passed is that it's not well written, and it's not really enforceable, and it's unfunded, and so on. I really can't speak to that. I'm just not an expert on that sort of thing, and so my observations are a little bit more general in nature. And I'm not a constitutional expert, like I'm Canadian, and so I don't know I understand the Second Amendment to a point, but I can't speak to the limits of that and the intent behind it and so on. I have my own opinions, but they're not well enough informed that I'll put them out here. I'll just make the note that I'm not. My purpose here is not to so much dig into the quality or the how well the law is written, but really just to make some reflections and to offer some reflections on the topic as a whole. And I'm kind of going to frame this as really first some just general observations on the questions of, well, what does the Bible say about this? And then questions, a couple questions for people on both sides of the issue. And of course, then you make up your own mind. But I should say too, just going in that obviously there's a couple things when I think about what to say, I'm not really at all concerned about hunting rifles or, the sorts of sport that people seem to enjoy. I'm not a hunter myself, but I really have no problem and no issues or concerns. And I don't think scripturally there's any issues or concerns with people who enjoy hunting, provided it's done responsibly and, carefully and that sort of thing. But that seems to not be really the issue that's at stake here. The real question is what are the limits and what is the extent of our freedoms and our abilities to own and to use firearms, and maybe what does the Bible say about that? And actually the answer is, well, nothing in one sense, right? The Bible actually, strictly speaking, does not say anything about guns, but it does, because guns weren't around. But it does talk about actually weapons. I mean, you see that God's people in their context and in their culture, they used weapons, and even Jesus actually at one point he actually says you need to be prepared for the world in which you live, which will be opposed to you and which will be violent, and so you need to arm yourself. Now, how do you interpret that, and should that be taken as a mandate and a sanctioning of, say, owning your own firearm to protect yourself? Well, I don't know that it does or it doesn't. I'm just simply pointing out that this is not a clear-cut issue as much as we would like. And my question has always been, is there room in our culture and in our context, is there room, and to what extent is there room for putting safeguards in place that might prevent or lower gun deaths that come about by gun violence? And the other thing I think is maybe good for us in America to remember is that this is, I wouldn't say it's exclusively an American issue, but this does seem to be a more American issue than you'd find in many, many other places around the world. And I'm not saying that that's good, bad, or otherwise. I'm simply making an observation that many other cultures, I think, view the American approach to firearm ownership and usage. It's strange to them. And again, I'm not saying that necessarily means that we've got it right or that we've got it wrong. I'm just saying, keep in mind that this is kind of a unique cultural, our understanding of firearms and our right to own them as broadly as we do is quite an American value. You don't, again, at least in my experience, you don't find that nearly to the same extent in other places. So do with that what you will, but it's just an observation. Now, questions to ask of both sides. I got to thinking a little bit about this. I mean, because I've seen it from both perspectives, and so here's, if I'm on the side that really favors gun control, if you are someone that really believes that what we need is more legislation and we need many, many more restrictions and limits on who can own firearms and how many and what sort, let me ask you this question. How much confidence are you placing in legislation as a way of managing and controlling human impulses? Right? Let me see if I can flesh that out a little bit. You believe that gun control is a necessary thing, and you believe that there should be more limits and more restrictions. But do these rules and does legislation have the ability to actually deal with the deeper root problems that are buried deep within the human heart? In other words, the biblical description of our nature is that our actions flow out of our hearts, and if it's our hearts that are corrupted, and it's our hearts that are by nature filled with malice and hostility and violence, then no amount of legislation can really fix that. And so it's a little bit, you have to, I think, grapple with the question of is it really overly optimistic, and is it really overly sort of idealistic to believe that if we just put the rules in place, then all of a sudden gun violence will decrease, and all of a sudden we'll solve all of these problems of shootings and killings and so on. Here's maybe some examples of what I mean by that. If you look at, there are certain places, and I picked one that I noted this to be true. Illinois has very strict gun legislation. I don't know if it's the strictest exactly in the world, but it's certainly up there. And so they have very, very strict limits on who can own weapons and what kind and so on. And yet, if you go to places in Illinois, especially like a city like Chicago, it has one of the highest murder rates in the country. And so you have all these rules in place, and yet that doesn't seem to bring about the desired effect. In other words, gun control works on people who tend to be law-abiding, and they're the ones that really don't need the gun control anyways. They're the ones, the people that you really need to target and that you really need to address are the people who are actually prone to breaking the law anyways. And so telling a person not to do something when they're already inclined to break laws is not going to have the desired effect. So if you're someone that is in favor of gun control, and you believe that, then I think you have to temper your expectations, and you have to honestly wrestle with that question of to what extent can rules affect the right sort of behavior. Now, here's the other side. If you're a person that believes in freedom on this issue, that there should be very, very few, if any, limits, then here's a couple questions for you. If your basis for supporting your point of view is primarily, and if your primary basis comes down to, well, the Second Amendment allows it, then my question for you is that really adequate from a Christian point of view? Is that adequate and sufficient grounds for pushing for this? In other words, another way to look at it is to say that I believe that the gospel and the Christian worldview is always going to be, it challenges every culture and every worldview and every sort of point of view that we have. And I think you have to ask, is it possible that the vision of the kingdom of God, does it challenge the Second Amendment? In other words, which one do you put first? And I'm not necessarily saying that everyone who believes that you have the right to bear arms is automatically not thinking from a biblical worldview. I'm just asking, how do you hold those two in tension, and to what extent do they fit together? And then here's my second question: if you tend to favor freedom, I think if you look at the biblical arc and the biblical storyline, what you find is that the trajectory, the arc of the storyline is meant to move us towards this point where we beat our swords into plowshares, right? And so in the new heavens and the new earth, the new creation, then all the instruments of inflicting violence and bloodshed and so on, all of those will be turned into the instruments of cultivation. And so if that's the trajectory that we're on, can where are we on that trajectory today? Like, how do you propose that we as a culture move towards that, even if we only, in our world, of course, we only get there sort of temporarily, but we want to seek that reality to the extent that it's possible even today. And so if you are opposed to restrictions and limits on guns and the freedom to own them and so on, then what do you propose that we do about the violence and the bloodshed that we've seen in our own country, that we've seen in our culture? How do you propose that we sort of limit that? And I'm not saying I even have the answer. I'm posing that as a question. If it doesn't come about by finding ways to limit firearms, then how do we see that? What do we do about this? And is there room in this worldview to say, you know what, we do have the right to bear arms, and there's something good about that, and there's something important about that, but is there also room to say that is, from a Christian point of view, there should be limits on that in order to, if nothing else, make it harder for this violence to happen and to take place. And so again, those are questions to think about. From my own vantage point, I actually see it both ways, and it might sound like I'm talking a little bit out of both sides of my mouth, but I'm sort of trying to evaluate and think this through. And I guess my one point of view is that really ultimately gun control is really more a symptom of a deeper issue. And I think that's where I feel most strongly from a Christian point of view. Gun control, there's a discussion on that, and there's a valuable discussion on that, but really what we have to be paying attention to, and I think what Christians can and should be more concerned about is really the condition of the human heart that often is and is capable of great violence and hatred and feeling this anger and then using a firearm to do something about that. I mean, at the end of the day, a person who goes in and shoots up a school or a workplace or something is there's a heart condition there that cannot be solved with gun rules. I mean, because the scary thing is that, especially in recent years, we've seen people who, instead of shooting up a place, are driving a car through a crowded street or something of that sort. And so the heart condition there remains the same, and that's really where our concern should be. And I think the other thing is that we should learn as Christians to critique our culture that often seems to glorify violence. Like we have this, and I think of it, especially from a young age, violent video games, and I'm not against video games at all, but some of them seem to really glorify the gore and the shooting and the killing and the death itself overall. And my concern is that we feed that so much beginning at a very young age, so that then by the time someone grows up or hits their teenage years, it's like the idea of shooting and killing is in their minds, it's become a game. And I think, in my own opinion, that's the greater concern. And so again, gun control rules may or may not help that to some extent, but ultimately that's not the real problem. The real problem is a condition of the heart that is capable of great evil. So, for what it's worth, leave your own thoughts in the comments. I'd be really interested to hear some feedback and some insightful perspective on this. If you tell me where I'm wrong, if you think I'm wrong, or agree with me, and share reasons why in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.